A letter crossed an ocean, a promise travelled with it. But when Constance Harrowby stepped down from the carriage at Ashmere Manor, clutching a photograph of the man she was meant to marry, the truth shattered everything. Because the English Marquis waiting for her was not the man in the picture. In a world bound by duty and deception, two wounded hearts will be forced to choose between what's proper and what's true. Secrets will rise from the ashes, love will defy reputation, and the walls of Ashmere will never be the same again. If you love emotional, timeless romances filled with passion and redemption, subscribe now and help us reach 1,000 hearts in this growing community of dreamers and believers. The Cotswolds, England, 1816. The road into the village, curled like a ribbon, lay gently across the green, disappearing and returning between hedgerows trimmed with a care that felt almost devotional. Beyond them, the hills rolled in soft, patient waves, dotted with sheep as white as spilled milk against winter-stunned grass. Honey-coloured cottages appeared in clusters, their stone walls warmed by the pale morning light, their chimneys breathing quiet smoke into an air that smelled of damp earth and wood fire. Inside the carriage, Constance Harrowby held her gloved hands very still in her lap, as if movement might betray the tremor she refused to acknowledge. The leather seat creaked beneath her with every rut in the road. Her slate-blue wool pelisse was fastened neatly to her throat, and beneath her dove-grey bonnet a few chestnut strands had escaped the pins at her temples, lifted now and then by the carriage's draught like nervous thoughts. She had lived too long in rooms where a woman's hope was treated like a foolish ornament. She had learned to fold desire into something smaller, something that could be hidden in the seam of a hem. And yet, as the village came into view, hope rose anyway, stubborn and disobedient, pressing against her ribs. In her reticule, wrapped carefully in wax paper, was the photograph. She had looked at it so many times that the edges had softened where her thumb had lingered. A gentleman's face stared back in quiet assurance, eyes steady, mouth touched with a faint smile that promised gentleness without weakness. A face that belonged to the letters, a face that had felt impossibly like rescue. Constance did not pretend the arrangement was romantic in the way young girls whispered about in novels. She understood what it meant to be chosen by paper and ink, to be sent for as if one were a parcel. Yet the letters had not read like a transaction. They had read like a hand offered in the dark. "You will not be alone again," one had said. She had clung to that line the way a drowning person clung to driftwood. The carriage slowed, then turned. The village fell behind them, and the lane narrowed, flanked by bare-limbed trees whose branches arched above like a cathedral of winter. Beyond the trees, iron gates appeared, black against the pale morning, crowned with a crest that looked severe and ancient. Ashmere. The driver called a brief greeting to the footman at the gate, and the carriage rolled forward. Constance's heart began to beat with a careful, painful insistence. She pressed her fingers to the reticule, feeling the shape of the photograph through the fabric as if it could anchor her. The estate unfolded in measured grandeur. A long drive, gravel crunching beneath the wheels, lawns trimmed even in the cold season. Stone walls the colour of cream, with veins of darker age. And then, at last, the manor itself rose ahead, not ostentatious, but commanding in its restraint. Tall windows, clean lines, and a silence that felt like a rule. The carriage stopped. Constance drew in a breath that tasted faintly of iron. She smoothed her gloves. She lifted her chin. She reminded herself that whatever waited beyond that carriage door, she would meet it, standing. The footman opened the door, and the air outside rushed in, cold and bracing. Constance stepped down carefully, her boots finding the gravel. Her shawl shifted. She adjusted it with practiced grace. Then she looked up. A man stood at the top of the manor steps. He was tall, broad-shouldered beneath a dark coat, his posture so controlled it seemed carved rather than lived. His hair was dark and neatly kept, his face angular, his mouth set in a line that did not soften at her arrival. His eyes, a deep blue-grey, fixed on her with a stillness that made Constance feel as if she had walked into the beam of a lantern. He was not the man in the photograph. For a moment, the world narrowed to that single, unforgiving fact. Constance's breath caught. The yard, the cold, the manor, even the sound of the horses seemed to recede. No, it could not be. It must be the light, the distance, her own nerves twisting reality into something cruel. She took a step forward. The man did not move down the steps. He did not smile. His gaze sharpened slightly, as if assessing a situation he had not requested, but knew he must endure. Behind him, the manor door opened. A steward appeared, stiff-backed, his face pinched with unease. A maid hovered just inside the threshold, hands folded, eyes lowered. Constance felt their attention as surely as if fingers were pressing at her skin. She lifted her reticule with care, drawing out the wax paper packet, unwrapping it with hands that now refused to be steady. The photograph emerged like a confession. She walked to the foot of the steps, her throat tight. "Lord Ashmere," she said, and even her voice sounded too small against the stone. "I am Constance Harrowby. I've come as arranged." The man's gaze dropped to the photograph. Everything about him changed in the space of a heartbeat. His face drained of colour, his jaw tightened, his eyes, a moment ago merely cold, flashed with something raw and terrible, as if a wound had been struck without warning. He descended the steps quickly, not with eagerness but with grim purpose. He stopped close enough that Constance could see the faint line between his brows, the tension in the muscles of his cheek. He did not reach for the photograph at first. He stared at it as if it were an insult. Then he took it. His fingers were bare, long, steady. But when his thumb brushed the edge of the image, Constance saw the smallest tremor like a crack in ice. "Where did you get this?" he asked. His voice was low, controlled, and yet beneath it lay something jagged. Not curiosity, not confusion. Something closer to restrained fury held in the fist of etiquette. Constance swallowed. "It was sent to me. With the letters." "The letters," he repeated, and his gaze lifted to hers. The look in his eyes made her stomach turn, not from fear of him, but from the sudden realization that he was holding grief like a weapon he had no choice but to carry. "Who wrote them?" "You did," Constance said softly. "Or, I believed you did." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Behind him the steward cleared his throat, as if to remind the world of propriety. "My lord," he murmured, strained. "Perhaps we should take this inside." The man did not look back. His eyes stayed on Constance, as if the only way he could remain upright was to keep her in place beneath his gaze. "I am the Marquis of Ashmere," he said at last, each word measured. "Albert Wyndham." The name landed like a final door closing. Constance's mouth went dry. "Then the gentleman in the photograph?" Albert's expression hardened. His fingers tightened around the image until Constance feared it might bend. "That is my brother." The air left her lungs. She had heard the word brother in passing, lightly in the letters, a fond mention, a joke about youthful mischief. Nothing that could have prepared her for the way Albert said it now, as if the word contained a grave. Constance blinked once, twice, trying to pull her thoughts into order. "Then, where is he?" Albert's eyes did not soften. "He is dead." Constance felt the ground tilt. The manor steps, the gravel, the winter air all seemed to shift, as if the world itself had decided to punish her for believing. "No," she whispered before she could stop herself. "That cannot be." Albert's mouth tightened. "It is." Her fingers curled around the strap of her reticule. A bitter heat rose behind her eyes, not quite tears, not yet. Shock first, then humiliation, then something worse. The fear of what came next. A woman alone, a woman fooled, a woman delivered to the wrong door. The steward stepped forward, voice clipped with the urgency of scandal. "My lord, this is highly irregular. The household is not prepared for—" "Enough," Albert said without turning. He looked at Constance again, and in that look she saw not kindness, but calculation. the practiced instinct of a man who had spent his life preventing disaster from spilling into the public eye. "You will return to the village immediately," he said. "My steward will arrange a carriage. You will be given sufficient funds to secure lodging until you can return to wherever you came from." The words were polite, even generous, but they were a dismissal, a closing of a gate, a sentence passed without appeal. Constance's humiliation flared into something steadier, pride perhaps, or desperation sharpened into resolve. She lifted her chin. "I will not accept your money." A flicker of surprise crossed Albert's face, quickly smothered. "You will," he said, calm as stone. "It is the appropriate remedy for this." "This," Constance interrupted, and her voice did not shake now, "is not a spill of tea that can be cleaned with coins." Albert's eyes narrowed slightly. "Miss Harrowby, I came here because I was invited," she said, and the words tasted like iron, like truth pulled from her own blood. "I came because I received letters that spoke of honor, of marriage, of protection." Albert's jaw tightened at the word protection, as if it mocked him. Constance forced herself to breathe. The air burned her throat. She would not plead. She would not break on the steps of a man who was not even the man who had called her here. She took a step closer, just enough that her voice could be lowered, just enough that the servants inside the door would not hear every word. "My lord," she said quietly now, "if I leave this house today, I will not simply be leaving disappointed. I will be leaving ruined." Albert's gaze held hers, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes that was not control, a flash of awareness, a recognition of how the world treated women who arrived with no rightful place to stand. Constance continued, the words coming with a strange calm that surprised even her. "The village already knows I've arrived. They will know if I am turned away. They will make a story of it. They will decide what kind of woman I am, and they will decide it loudly." Albert's nostrils flared faintly. "That is not my concern." "It is," Constance said, and something in her tone made the steward shift uneasily. "Because your name will be in that story as well." Albert's eyes sharpened. Constance reached into her reticule again and drew out a folded paper, one of the last letters she had kept closest. She did not offer it like evidence. She held it like a wound. "I am not asking you for romance," she said. "I am asking you for shelter, and in exchange I can offer you what you clearly want." Albert's gaze dropped to the letter, then lifted again. "And what do I want, Miss Harrowby?" "A season," Constance said. "A season of silence. A season where the village sees an engagement, not a scandal. Let me remain here as you're intended for a short time. Let the whispers grow bored and move on. When the season ends, you may dismiss me quietly. I will leave without disgrace. You will be spared the spectacle." The steward's eyes widened. "My lord, absolutely not." Albert raised one hand, and the steward fell silent as if the air itself had been cut. Albert studied Constance the way a man studies a storm cloud, judging whether it will pass or break over his land. "You are proposing," he said slowly, "a deception." Constance's mouth tightened. "I am proposing survival." For a long moment, Albert said nothing. The cold wind moved through the bare trees. Somewhere in the distance a rook called, harsh and lonely. Then Albert looked down at the photograph again, and his face shifted, just slightly, as if grief had pressed its thumb into the clay of his composure. He handed the image back to her, but his fingers brushed hers in the exchange, and the contact lasted one heartbeat longer than it needed to. It was nothing. It was everything. Constance felt it like a spark beneath her glove. Albert spoke quietly, and the words were not kind, but they were not cruel either. They were the words of a man who could not afford to be gentle. "If you remain," he said, "you will abide by my rules. You will not speak of my brother. You will not ask questions. You will not wander where you are not invited." Constance held his gaze. "And you will not allow your household to treat me as a criminal." Albert's eyes tightened as if he did not enjoy being negotiated with. "You will be treated as my guest," he said, "and in public, as my intended." The steward inhaled sharply, scandalized. The maid inside the doorway turned her head away, as if already refusing to witness what would become gossip for months. Constance's heart hammered, but she forced herself to speak with the composure she had learned through necessity. "Then it is agreed." Albert's gaze lingered on her face, and for one treacherous instant his eyes softened, not with affection, but with something like reluctant respect. Then the mask returned. "Come inside," he said. Constance stepped forward, past the threshold, into the manor's warmth and shadows. The door closed behind her with a sound that felt final, as if she had crossed not only into a house, but into a life that would demand everything she had. As she handed her cloak to a waiting servant, Constance felt Albert's presence beside her, like a storm held on a leash. She could not tell whether he would protect her or destroy her, but when she turned her head slightly, she found his gaze on her again, steady, guarded and far too aware. "I will not shame you in my home," he said in a low voice meant only for her. Constance's throat tightened. She did not trust promises anymore. Not written, not spoken. And yet, against all reason, she felt the smallest shift inside her, like a door that had been bolted for years and had just impossibly moved. "I am not asking for kindness," she replied softly. "Only fairness." Albert's eyes held hers one breath longer. "Fairness," he echoed. "Very well." And with that single word, the bargain began. Cold as winter on the surface, and underneath it, trembling with something neither of them yet dared to name. The morning at Ashmere began in silence, as if the house itself were waiting to decide whether it would accept its unexpected guest. Frost had gathered overnight on the windowsills, turning every pane into a blurred mirror of silver light. When Constance awoke, she did not recognize the ceiling above her, the white plaster framed by dark beams, the faint pattern of age upon the walls. Her breath rose faintly in the cold air, and for one long moment she could not recall where she was. Then the sound of distant footsteps reminded her. The manor, the bargain. The man who had looked at her as though she were a complication he must contain. Constance sat up and wrapped her shawl around her shoulders. Her trunk had been placed neatly at the foot of the bed. Someone had arranged a small vase of winter heather on the table beside the window. A kindness, perhaps, or a gesture of formality. She stood slowly, every movement deliberate, as though she were performing before an invisible audience. The door opened with a soft creak. Mrs. Pritchard, the housekeeper, entered with the calm authority of someone who had run the household for decades. Her grey-streaked hair was pinned tightly under her cap, her apron spotless. "Good morning, Miss Harrowby," she said, her tone polite but cautious. "His lordship requests that you take breakfast in the small dining room at 9. Constance inclined her head. "Thank you." Mrs. Pritchard hesitated, her eyes flicking briefly toward the trunk. "If you require assistance in unpacking, one of the maids can be sent up." "That will not be necessary," Constance replied gently. "I prefer to keep my own things in order." The housekeeper nodded, the smallest flicker of surprise crossing her face before she withdrew, leaving the faint scent of lavender soap behind her. When Constance dressed, she chose her simplest gown, a pale muslin with long sleeves and modest lace at the collar, and pinned her hair back into a low, tidy knot. She studied herself in the mirror, searching for the woman she had been yesterday on the carriage road. That woman had carried hope like a fragile bird in her palms. This one carried resolve. By the time she descended the stairs, the manor was alive with quiet activity. Servants moved soundlessly along the corridors. The scent of firewood and baked bread drifted through the air. Constance paused in the entryway, her gloved hands clasped before her, uncertain which door led to the small dining room. Before she could ask, Albert Wyndham appeared at the far end of the hall. He walked with the kind of controlled precision that belonged to men who had long ago learned to hide weariness behind posture. His dark tailcoat fitted perfectly, his cravat tied with military perfection. His expression did not change when he saw her. "Good morning, Miss Harrowby," he said, his voice steady but distant. Constance curtsied lightly. "My lord." He gestured toward a door half-opened. "Breakfast is served." The room was modest compared to the grand dining hall she glimpsed beyond. Small, sunlit, with a view of the frost-covered gardens. A single fire burned in the grate, and on the table stood a simple service of tea, eggs, and bread. Albert took his place at the head of the table. Constance sat to his right, careful to leave distance between them. The silence stretched, filled only by the clink of porcelain and the faint crackle of firewood. Finally he spoke. "You slept well?" "As well as one can in a strange house," she replied, her voice calm, though her heart beat faster than she wished. "I trust the room is comfortable." "It is," she said. "It is very fine." Albert nodded once, as if comfort were a logistical matter, not a human one. He poured tea into her cup, his movements measured and silent. For several minutes, neither spoke. The quiet might have been peaceful if not for the invisible tension that threaded between them. Constance could feel his restraint, the way one felt a storm about to break. A pressure in the air, not yet thunder but close. When she finally found courage to meet his gaze, he was already watching her. "You understand the terms of our arrangement," he said, his tone low. "Your presence here is temporary, for appearances only." "Yes, my lord. You will be treated with respect. In return, I expect discretion. The staff will not hear gossip from your lips." Constance set down her cup, her fingers steady. "I have no interest in gossip." Albert studied her for a long moment. "Good. Then we are agreed." A pause followed, softer, heavier. Then Constance spoke with quiet conviction. "My lord, I would only ask one thing." His brow lifted slightly. "Which is, that I not be hidden away like an embarrassment. If this is to be a pretense, then let it be one that convinces. I will not cower in corners." The faintest trace of something like surprise crossed his features, quickly replaced by his habitual composure. "You are bold, Miss Harrowby." "Only practical," she said softly. "Rumors thrive in shadows. I would rather they see me." Albert's mouth curved, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. "Very well. You will dine with the household and attend Sunday service at my side. Beyond that, you may take walks on the grounds or read in the library, provided you do not disturb my work." "Understood." He looked at her then, not as a problem to solve, but as a person to be measured. "You are not what I expected." "Neither are you," she replied, before she could stop herself. His gaze sharpened, the air between them changed, warmer, denser. He leaned back slightly, and for the briefest instant his control faltered. A flicker of curiosity, almost admiration, moved behind his eyes before he stood, pushing back his chair. "I have matters to attend," he said. "Mrs. Pritchard will see to your needs." As he left, Constance exhaled slowly, the sound trembling in the air like the last note of a song. The hours that followed passed in a strange stillness. Constance explored the manor cautiously, moving through corridors lined with portraits that seemed to watch her. The great staircase curved upward toward galleries washed in winter light, and the scent of old wood and polish lingered everywhere. In the library, she paused before the tall windows, where the frost had begun to melt into delicate beads of water. The shelves rose higher than she could reach, filled with volumes bound in fading leather. She trailed her fingers along the spines, wondering which ones Albert touched, which he read in silence when the house was asleep. A voice startled her. "You'll find few in this house, brave enough to disturb his lordship's books." Constance turned. The speaker was the steward, Mr. Hargreaves, his expression tight with disapproval. "I meant no offence," she said calmly. "None taken, miss," he replied, though his tone said otherwise. "It's simply not a place for guests to wander." "I'm not merely a guest," Constance said, meeting his eyes. "I'm to be seen as his lordship's intended." The steward's jaw tightened. "A title, miss, does not make it so." Her spine straightened. "Neither does your opinion." A flicker of something, resentment, perhaps respect, crossed his face before he bowed stiffly and withdrew. Constance stood alone once more, her pulse quick and uneven. Later that afternoon, the housekeeper found her seated by the library fire, a book open in her lap. "You'll forgive me, miss," Mrs. Pritchard said gently, "but there are ways things are done here. Some may need time to adjust." Constance looked up, her voice softer now. "I understand. I do not wish to be a burden." Mrs. Pritchard hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Burden is not the word I'd use. His lordship has lived with shadows for too long. The house feels different when there's a voice in it." "Does it trouble him?" Constance asked. The housekeeper's gaze drifted toward the door. "He is not an easy man, miss, but not a cruel one. That is more than I can say for most." When Mrs. Pritchard left, Constance sat for a long time watching the flames. She wondered what kind of woman had once filled these rooms with laughter. The Marquis's mother still presided upstairs, distant, formidable, but there was no mistress of the house, no warmth that spoke of companionship. By evening, the manor's rhythm had softened. The staff moved quietly through the halls, preparing supper. Constance was told to dine privately again, but as she sat alone before her untouched plate, she felt a restlessness she could not name. She rose, walked toward the door, and paused when she heard voices in the adjoining study. Albert's voice carried, steady, clipped, yet undeniably weary. "No, Hargreaves, she will remain. That is my decision." The steward's tone followed, cautious but firm. "My lord, it sets tongues wagging. A woman with no family, no name of note." Albert cut him off. "She has mine now. That will be sufficient." Constance's breath caught. She stepped back, unseen, her hand pressed to her chest. The words were nothing more than practical truth, but hearing them spoken with such finality sent a tremor through her. When she returned to her room, the corridors were lit only by flickering sconces. Her reflection in the window looked almost spectral, a woman suspended between scandal and salvation. A knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find Albert standing there, a candle in hand. The light carved his features in gold and shadow, softening the severity that daylight always seemed to harden. "I hope I am not disturbing you," he said. "No," she replied quietly, uncertain whether she breathed the word or merely thought it. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I spoke to the steward. He will respect your place here." "I heard," she said before she could stop herself. "You said I had your name." Albert blinked, surprised, then inclined his head slightly. "It is a shield, Miss Harrowby, nothing more." "I know," she whispered, "but even a shield is something to be grateful for." For a heartbeat, neither moved. The candle's flame wavered between them, casting their shadows together on the wall. Albert's voice, when it came, was softer. "Do not mistake my courtesy for sentiment." "I would never dare," she said, though her pulse betrayed her. He studied her face, the calm strength in her eyes, the way her hands remained folded though she was trembling. "You are not afraid of me," he said, almost as a question. "I am afraid of nothing that tells the truth," Constance replied. Albert's mouth curved faintly, something like reluctant admiration glimmering in his eyes. "Then you may find yourself the most unusual woman ever to step inside this house. And you, my lord," she said quietly, "may find yourself the most unusual man to let her stay." A silence followed, deep, breathless, the kind that seems to listen. Then Albert inclined his head, his composure returning like a cloak around him. "Good night, Miss Harrowby." "Good night, my lord." He turned to go, but as he reached the corridor he hesitated. The candlelight caught the edge of his profile, revealing a flicker of something uncertain, almost human. "Miss Harrowby," he said without facing her, "if you ever feel unsafe here, you may come to me directly." The words were simple, but they carried weight, the promise of protection from a man who did not give promises lightly. Constance's voice trembled as she answered, "I shall remember that." When he was gone, she closed the door and leaned against it. Her eyes closed. The silence pressed around her again, Yet it was no longer the silence of a stranger's house. It was the silence of something beginning, fragile, uncertain, but alive, and as she blew out her candle, the faintest trace of warmth lingered in her chest, the echo of a voice that had said, "You have my name now." She lay awake long after midnight, watching the pale moonlight drift across the ceiling, wondering why a simple act of mercy from a distant man could make her heart feel both protected and perilously unguarded all at once. The next Sunday morning unfolded under a sky the colour of pewter. The village bells rang clear and insistent through the Cotswolds valley, their sound carrying over hedgerows, glistening with dew. At Ashmere Manor, Constance stood before her mirror in a state of quiet defiance, fastening the ribbon of her pale muslin bonnet with fingers that trembled only slightly. It would be her first appearance in public beside the Marquis, her first true test beneath the gaze of those who whispered. Her gown was simple, white muslin with faint blue embroidery at the hem, modest in cut but graceful in movement. Over it she wore her slate blue pelisse, newly brushed, the wool still soft despite its years. The reflection that looked back at her was calm. Though her heart beat in a restless rhythm, she was no stranger to judgment, yet this time the stakes were different. One wrong expression, one sign of uncertainty, and every smile in the village would sharpen into cruelty. A knock sounded. "Come in," she said softly. Mrs. Pritchard entered, her expression brisk yet motherly. "The carriage will be ready in 10 minutes, Miss Harrowby." "Thank you," Constance replied, turning slightly. "Has his lordship gone down?" "Already waiting," the housekeeper said, then hesitated. "You look very well, miss, quite the picture of grace." Constance offered a small smile. "Grace is all I have left to wear, Mrs. Pritchard." The housekeeper's eyes softened. "Sometimes grace is armour, and armour is what keeps a woman standing." When Constance descended the grand staircase, Albert was waiting in the entry hall. He was dressed impeccably in a dark coat and crisp cravat, his expression composed, unreadable. The winter light caught in his hair, turning it to a deep bronze at the edges. He glanced at her, and for a heartbeat, something in his eyes flickered. Approval, perhaps admiration, quickly veiled again. "Miss Harrowby," he said with a polite nod. "You are ready?" "Yes, my lord." He offered his arm, the gesture flawless, practiced. Constance placed her gloved hand lightly upon it, aware of the warmth beneath the wool, of the faint tension in his posture. To anyone watching, they were the perfect image of an engaged couple. To Constance, it felt like standing on the edge of something she could not yet name. The carriage ride to the village was quiet. Outside, the countryside rolled past in muted tones of brown and green, the hedgerows bending beneath the weight of frost. Inside, the silence between them felt charged rather than empty. Albert spoke first, his tone restrained. "You need not speak to anyone who addresses you out of curiosity. I will handle it." "I have no fear of curiosity," she said softly, "only of pity." His gaze shifted toward her. "They will not pity you if they believe you belong beside me." "And do I?" The question slipped from her lips before she could stop it. She meant it half in jest, half in sorrow. Albert's jaw tightened, his gaze returned to the window. "For the moment," he said, "yes." Constance turned her face toward the blurred glass, her reflection faint against the grey sky. "Then I shall do my best to look as though I do." The church stood at the heart of the village, its bell tower rising from a sea of cottages. As the carriage drew near, villagers turned to watch, hats tipping, whispers beginning before the horses even halted. The Marquis had not attended service for several weeks, and his return, with a lady beside him, was enough to stir a storm of curiosity. Albert stepped down first, offering his hand. Constance placed hers in his, and for a moment the world quieted. His grip was firm, steady, and she felt an almost imperceptible pause as their eyes met. Then, with perfect composure, he guided her toward the church doors. Inside, the air was cool and heavy with incense and the faint scent of beeswax. The congregation turned subtly, pretending not to stare. Constance could feel their eyes like threads pulling at the edges of her confidence. Albert escorted her to the front pew, their footsteps echoing softly against the stone floor. When they knelt together for prayer, she could feel the nearness of him, the brush of his sleeve, the faint rhythm of his breath. The simple act of being beside him filled her with a strange mix of security and danger. It was not affection, not yet, but something that trembled on the edge of it, a shared silence that carried more meaning than any vow. After the service, they stood in the churchyard as villagers approached, all politeness and hidden judgment. Miss Eloise Sykes, the vicar's niece, was the first to glide forward, her smile bright as polished silver. "My lord," she said, curtsying elegantly, "we have missed your presence these past Sundays." Albert inclined his head. "Miss Sykes. And you must be Miss Harrowby." Eloine's tone dripped with sweetness. "We have heard so much of you. How wonderful to see Ashmere alive again with company." Constance returned the smile with quiet poise. "You are kind, Miss Sykes." "Oh, not at all," Eloine continued, her eyes sweeping over Constance's gown, lingering on the modest fabric. "We so rarely have newcomers of distinction." Albert's voice cut through the chill air, calm but sharp. "Distinction is not measured by novelty, Miss Sykes." Eloine's composure faltered for a heartbeat before she laughed lightly. "Of course, my lord. How wise you always are." Constance felt the sting of the encounter, but refused to let it show. She stood straight, every movement deliberate. When the small talk finally ended, Albert offered his arm again and guided her back to the carriage. Once inside, the door shut with a dull thud, sealing them in. "Was that cruelty meant for me or for you?" Constance asked quietly. Albert looked at her, the faintest trace of frustration crossing his face. "For both, perhaps. The village protects its own myths. It does not like surprises." She turned toward him, her tone calm but firm. "Then we must give them something else to talk about." He raised a brow. "And what do you suggest?" "A performance worthy of their attention," she said. "If they must gossip, let them at least be confused by what they see." Albert studied her in silence, the corner of his mouth tightening. Not quite amusement, but something close. "You play your part well, Miss Harrowby." "And you, my lord," she replied softly, "seem to have forgotten how to play yours." For a moment, the mask of the Marquis slipped. He turned away, his voice quieter now, touched with something almost weary. "There was a time when I thought performance unnecessary. And now?" "Now," he said, meeting her eyes. "I know that survival demands it." They rode the rest of the way in thoughtful silence. When they returned to Ashmere, the manor was filled with the low hum of midday activity. Servants moved through the halls. Voices hushed, as though the entire house waited for Albert's mood to be measured before breathing freely again. Constance removed her gloves and bonnet in the small salon, grateful for the fire's warmth. Albert lingered near the window, one hand resting on the sill, the light outlining his profile. He looked almost carved from the stone of his own house. "You are angry," she said quietly. "Not angry," he replied. "Merely reminded of the cost of peace. It requires constant payment." Constance hesitated. "You could ignore them. You are the Marquis. Their opinions cannot touch you." He turned toward her, his expression unreadable. "They can touch everything I am responsible for. My name, my estate, those who depend upon me. I have lived long enough to know that reputation can destroy what integrity builds." His words hung in the air, heavy and honest. Constance looked at him and saw, beneath the cold precision, a man carrying the weight of duty like a chain. She felt the pull of compassion, fierce and sudden. "My lord," she said softly, "I would not be the cause of more burden." "You are not," he answered. "You are merely the consequence of someone else's lies. The burden was already here." The gentleness in his tone surprised her. Before she could reply, Lady Ashmere appeared in the doorway. Albert straightened at once. His mother was tall, her silver hair arranged with impeccable care, her gown a rich plum colour that whispered of old authority. "My dear," she said coolly, her gaze settling on Constance. I see you've joined us for Sunday service. How commendable." Constance curtsied slightly. "It is a pleasure, madam." "Indeed." The older woman's smile did not reach her eyes. "You must forgive the villagers if they appear curious. They do so love a story." Albert's voice hardened. "Mother." Lady Ashmere lifted one graceful hand. "I mean no offence, Albert. It is merely that gossip thrives where mystery lingers. If one intends to play the part of a fiancé, one must remember that every gesture will be studied." Constance met her gaze evenly. "Then I shall try to perform to expectation, my lady." For a heartbeat, the older woman's eyes softened. Whether in respect or surprise, Constance could not tell. Then Lady Ashmere nodded curtly and withdrew. Albert released a slow breath. "You handled that better than most." "Your mother has a sharp wit," Constance said, "and a sharper memory," he replied. "She forgets nothing, forgives less." Their eyes met, and a silence settled between them again, warmer this time, tinged with reluctant admiration. As afternoon faded into dusk, Constance found herself drawn to the manor's gallery, where the portraits of the Wyndham family watched from their gilded frames. She studied the generations of solemn faces until her gaze stopped at a blank space on the wall, an empty rectangle of lighter color where a painting had once hung, a void in a lineage, a silence in the story. When Albert entered moments later, she did not turn immediately. "There was another portrait here once," she said. He stood beside her, his presence close, steady. "Yes." "Of your brother?" His voice cooled, quiet but edged. "That subject is not open for discussion." Constance faced him, unflinching. "Forgive me, I meant no intrusion." Albert looked away, his jaw tense. "You are not the first to ask. They all do. I simply no longer have the patience to answer." Her voice softened. "Perhaps patience is not what you need. Perhaps honesty would be kinder." He turned sharply, his eyes suddenly alive with emotion too raw to name. "Kindness does not resurrect the dead, Miss Harrowby." The word struck her like a sudden wind. Yet beneath the pain in his tone, she heard something else, guilt, old and unhealed. "I did not mean to reopen wounds," she said gently. Albert's gaze softened, regret flickering through it. "You have a way of doing so without meaning to." She smiled faintly. "Then I shall try to be less honest." His lips curved barely. "I suspect that would be impossible for you." Their eyes met, and for a long, suspended moment, neither spoke. The firelight painted warmth across his features, catching in the silver thread of his cravat, softening the coldness she had first seen in him. The air between them changed, delicate as the moment before a confession. But Albert turned away first. "Good evening, Miss Harrowby." "Good evening, my lord," she murmured, though her heart lingered where his had turned. When he left the gallery, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything neither had dared to say. Constance stood before the missing portrait, the faint outline glowing in the dim light, and whispered to the shadows, "It is not only the dead who are lost, my lord. Some of us are still looking for where we belong." Outside, the church bells rang again for evening prayers, their sound floating across the fields like a promise that mercy, if it came, would come slowly, and only to those brave enough to wait for it. The following morning arrived veiled in mist, soft and white as a bridal veil across the Cotswolds hills. At Ashmere Manor, the fog pressed gently against the windows, turning the world beyond into a secret. The house stirred slowly. Footsteps in corridors, the low murmur of servants lighting fires, the faint clatter of porcelain as breakfast was laid. Constance stood by her window, wrapped in a wool shawl, gazing out at the ghostly gardens. The silence was deceptive. Beneath it, she sensed the tension of a household that measured every breath against its master's mood. The memory of Albert's words from the day before lingered still, heavy and restless. She had seen the wound behind his restraint, the anger that was less about her question than about his own heart refusing to heal. She could not blame him for grief, but she could not live beside silence without searching for truth. When she entered the breakfast room, Albert was already seated, reading a letter. His coat was dark, his cravat immaculate, his posture that of a man for whom order was both shield and weapon. He lifted his gaze briefly as she entered. "Good morning, Miss Harrowby," he said. "Good morning, my lord." The words were polite, too careful. She took her seat, the silverware gleaming like small promises she did not trust. The silence between them was fragile as glass until Albert folded his letter neatly and spoke. "I will be occupied with estate business today," he said. "Mr. Hargreaves will attend to the tenant accounts, and I expect you may wish to accompany Lady Ashmere for her visits in the village." Constance hesitated. "If your mother wishes it." "She has been informed," he replied, sipping his tea. Then, after a pause, his eyes flicked to hers. "I would advise you not to wander beyond the western wing. Some rooms there are sealed for repairs." The warning was casual, yet his tone carried the faintest undercurrent, something more than simple caution. Constance inclined her head, but said nothing. Later, when Lady Ashmere's carriage took them toward the village, Constance endured the older woman's poised silences and delicate assessments. The Marquis's mother wore her dignity like armor. Even her smile seemed rehearsed. "You must forgive the villagers," Lady Ashmere said at last, her gloved hand resting lightly on her lap. "They are provincial in their understanding of rank. They expect clear boundaries. Who belongs, who does not." Constance looked out the window at the narrow streets, the clusters of cottages, the shopkeepers pausing to watch the passing carriage. "Perhaps boundaries are less important than kindness, my lady." Lady Ashmere's mouth curved faintly, though her eyes remained cool. "Kindness is admirable, Miss Harrowby, but it rarely protects a woman." When they returned that afternoon, the mist had lifted, leaving the manor bathed in muted gold. Constance climbed the steps slowly, her mind still turning over the older woman's words. Kindness may not protect, but what did? She had lived long enough to know that silence could destroy as swiftly as cruelty. The house was quiet when she re-entered. Somewhere above, the faint echo of footsteps resounded and faded. She walked toward the gallery, the long corridor where family portraits watched in solemn judgment. The empty space where the missing painting had hung still caught her eye, a pale rectangle of absence that refused to let her look away. Something about it called to her. That evening, after supper, Constance wandered again through the west corridor. The lamps had been extinguished. Only the firelight from the drawing room glowed faintly behind her. She walked slowly, tracing her hand along the carved wooden panels. A draught of cold air brushed her neck. Somewhere, a door creaked. Her pulse quickened. She turned a corner and found herself before a locked door, one she had not noticed before. The handle was brass, dulled by time, and the keyhole glittered faintly in the dim light. She tried it gently. It did not move. "Miss Harrowby." The voice came from behind her, low and steady. She turned sharply. Albert stood a few paces away, his face half lit by the glow of a single lamp he held. The light threw his features into sharp relief, the line of his jaw, the shadow beneath his cheekbones, the quiet authority in his eyes. Her breath caught. "My lord," she said softly, "I was only exploring," he finished for her, "against my advice." His tone was not harsh, but there was tension beneath it, a warning threaded with concern. "I meant no harm," she said. "The house is large and I lose my way easily. Is that the truth?" The question was gentle, but it pierced like a blade. Constance held his gaze. "It is, but I will admit my curiosity. You warned me away from this wing, and I cannot help wondering why." Albert's eyes darkened slightly. "Because some doors are better left closed." She took a small step closer, her voice quiet but firm. "And some wounds heal faster when they are opened to light." The silence that followed was taut, intimate. He regarded her as if weighing whether to trust her or to retreat behind the wall he had so carefully built. "Do you always speak so plainly?" he asked at last. "Only when I am frightened," she replied. He looked at her. the corners of his mouth tightening, not in mockery, but as if her words had disarmed him. "You are frightened now?" he asked. "Not of you," she said, "of being forever kept in shadows." Albert lowered the lamp slightly, its glow softening between them. "You have a dangerous way of turning honesty into courage. And you, my lord," she murmured, "have a dangerous way of mistaking distance for control." For a moment, neither moved. The air between them vibrated with a tension too fragile to name. Then Albert drew a breath and stepped past her, his hand reaching for the key that hung from a chain at his waist. Without another word, he unlocked the door. The hinges groaned softly as the door opened to reveal a room thick with dust and memory. The faint smell of old smoke lingered, mingled with the scent of wood and forgotten perfume. Inside, the light of the lamp fell upon a desk covered in papers, a chair draped with a coat long untouched, and on the wall, an outline where a portrait had once hung. Constance entered slowly. "This was his room," she whispered. Albert's expression did not change, but his knuckles whitened around the lamp. Yes, the quiet was heavy with ghosts. Constance looked around. At the half-burned candle, the books stacked unevenly on a shelf, the faint indentation where someone's hand had once rested too often on the desk. "You kept it as it was," she said softly. "It was my mother's wish," he replied. "She says it honors him. I say it chains us all to the past." Constance turned toward him, her eyes filled with a tenderness she did not try to hide. "Grief is a cruel architect. It builds walls around those who survive." Albert met her gaze. "And what does your grief build, Miss Harrowby?" "A door," she said after a pause, "one I keep opening, hoping someone will walk through." The words hung between them, delicate and true. Albert set the lamp on the desk and stepped closer, his presence filling the small room. "You should not be here," he said quietly. "And yet you brought me," she replied. His eyes searched hers, his control slipping again, just slightly. "You test my restraint." Constance's voice was barely a whisper. "I test your silence." The lamp's flame trembled, and in that flickering light, something unspoken passed between them. A recognition, a spark of understanding that neither dared name. Albert turned away first, picking up a stack of papers from the desk. "These were found among his things," he said, his tone returning to formality. "Letters, debts, mistakes, none of them your concern." "I understand," Constance said softly, "but perhaps they are yours." His gaze snapped to hers, sharp and pained. "You presume too much." "Perhaps," she said, steady, "but I have learned that those who presume nothing learn nothing at all." Albert exhaled slowly, the edge of anger melting into something closer to exhaustion. "You are a stubborn woman. Only with men who hide behind duty," she said. His lips curved faintly, though his eyes remained grave. "Then I fear you will spend a lifetime quarreling with me." "Perhaps," she said, her heart unsteady. "Or perhaps I will teach you to surrender now and then." For an instant, the world stilled. The mist outside pressed against the windows, the lamp burned low, and in that narrow space filled with dust and memory, they stood too close for propriety, too far for confession. Albert's hand brushed against hers as he reached for the lamp. It was the lightest touch, barely a graze, but it sent a current through her veins. His breath caught, almost imperceptibly. He withdrew his hand as though the contact had burned him. "You should go," he said softly, "before I forget the difference between honesty and madness." Constance hesitated. "And which do you fear more?" His gaze held hers, unflinching. "You." The word fell between them, heavy as a vow. Constance turned then, her steps slow, her heartbeat louder than her own thoughts. She left the room without looking back, the sound of the door closing behind her like a secret sealed again. In the corridor she paused, her fingers trembling against the fabric of her gown. Her pulse still carried the echo of his voice, the warmth of that fleeting touch. She leaned against the wall, closing her eyes for a moment, steadying herself. Some doors, she thought, were locked, not to keep the living out, but to keep the truth from escaping. That night, As she sat by her bedroom fire, she could not stop remembering the look in his eyes, how grief and desire had warred quietly behind his composure, how the gentlest brush of his hand had felt like a confession. She told herself she had only sought understanding, but as she stared into the flames, she knew the truth. What she sought now was no longer silence. It was him. And somewhere in the depths of Ashmere Manor, behind the door he had locked once more, Albert Wyndham stood in his brother's room, his hand still trembling slightly, whispering to no one, "She should never have come here. And yet, if she hadn't, I might never have remembered how it feels to be alive." The winter sun lay low above the Cotswolds, pale and distant, bathing the village in a muted glow that could not warm the bones. At Ashmere Manor, preparations were underway for the small gathering that Lady Ashmere insisted upon every December, a genteel afternoon of tea, music, and conversation meant to remind the village that refinement still ruled above rumour. Yet this year, refinement would share its place with curiosity, for the Marquis's elusive fiancée would make her first true social appearance among them. Constance Harrowby stood before the long mirror in her chamber, the fire crackling softly behind her. Mrs. Pritchard fastened the final ribbon of her pale rose gown, smoothing the muslin sleeves with gentle, capable hands. "It suits you, miss," the housekeeper said, stepping back to admire her work. "Soft colour, but strong stitching. You'll outshine them without meaning to." Constance smiled faintly at her reflection. "I have no wish to outshine anyone. I only wish not to tremble." Mrs. Pritchard's eyes softened. "Then remember what I've learned in this house. When you fear you might fall, stand straighter." Constance met her gaze in the mirror. "Has that always worked for you?" "Most days," Mrs. Pritchard said, adjusting her cap. "And on the others, I pretend it does." When the housekeeper left, Constance remained still for a moment, her hands resting on the small wooden dressing table. The scent of lavender water lingered in the air. She stared at her reflection, not at the gown or the hair carefully pinned with modest pearls, but at her own eyes. There was strength there she had not known she possessed, though she wondered whether it would survive the afternoon. Outside, the sound of wheels crunching over gravel announced the arrival of guests. The clatter of carriage doors, the murmur of greetings. Constance drew a long, steady breath, then descended the staircase with quiet grace. Albert awaited her at the foot of the stairs. He wore a dark tailcoat, his posture rigid, but his eyes watchful. When she reached him, his gaze lingered briefly on her face before he offered his arm. "You needn't look so solemn, my lord," she said softly. "We are meant to be celebrating." He inclined his head. "Celebration, Miss Harrowby, is an art I have not practiced in years." "Then perhaps today you will remember how," she replied, taking his arm. He said nothing, but his fingers tightened imperceptibly where her hand rested. The drawing room was bright with the afternoon sun. A fire glowed in the hearth, its warmth softened by the hum of polite conversation. Villagers and local gentry filled the space. Women in pastel gowns, men in finely brushed coats, tea steamed from porcelain cups, and the scent of spiced cakes mingled with perfume and gossip. As Constance and Albert entered, all murmurs seemed to hush at once. Heads turned, smiles widened, the air grew taut with curiosity. "Lord Ashmere," Miss Elowen Sykes exclaimed, gliding forward with a practiced smile, "how lovely to see you among us again. And Miss Harrowby, what a pleasure to finally meet the woman who has inspired such speculation." Constance's lips curved gently. "I did not realize I was the subject of poetry, Miss Sykes." "Not poetry," Elowen replied sweetly, "though your arrival has certainly stirred the imagination of many." Albert's voice cut through the room with quiet authority. "Then perhaps they will find something more productive to occupy it." The crowd shifted, some hiding smiles, others turning their attention to the refreshments with feigned indifference. Elowen's eyes glimmered with restrained irritation. "I only meant admiration, my lord," she said, her tone honeyed. "Miss Harrowby is most fortunate." Albert inclined his head. "Indeed she is. As am I." The murmurs rose again, this time with surprise. Constance felt the weight of every glance in the room, the press of whispered questions. She steadied her breath and offered her hand to Elowen. "It is kind of you to welcome me." Elowen took her hand, squeezing lightly, too lightly to be sincere. "Of course, my dear. The village thrives on good manners." Albert leaned closer to Constance, his voice low enough for her alone. "You see why I avoid these gatherings. And yet," she murmured back, "you endure them for appearance's sake. As do I." He looked at her then, the edge of admiration flickering behind his restraint. "You were not made for deception, Miss Harrowby." "Perhaps," she said quietly, "but I was not made for humiliation either." Their eyes held a moment too long before he turned away, greeting the vicar with formal courtesy. The musicians began to play, a gentle waltz from the corner of the room. Couples moved to the cleared space near the hearth. Constance stood apart, watching the swirl of fabric and light, the way laughter filled the air like delicate glass that might shatter at the smallest false step. Lady Ashmere approached, regal in deep plum silk, her expression unreadable. "You are admired this afternoon," she said. Constance inclined her head. "Admiration is fickle, my lady." "And yet it serves its purpose," Lady Ashmere replied. "Appearances matter, Miss Harrowby, particularly when truth is inconvenient." Before Constance could respond, Albert rejoined them. "Mother," he said evenly, "surely the afternoon is not meant for lectures." "Only reminders," Lady Ashmere said, her eyes lingering on her son before she moved away to greet other guests. Albert exhaled softly. "She means well in her way." "I doubt she believes I do," Constance replied with quiet humour. Albert's gaze softened for a fraction of a second. "You managed to endure with remarkable composure." "It is not composure, my lord," she said. "It is necessity." The music changed again, a slower, gentler rhythm. Albert extended his hand. "Then let us endure together, Miss Harrowby. Will you dance?" Constance hesitated only a breath before placing her hand in his. "I will." The crowd parted. Curiosity rekindled. As they stepped onto the floor, Constance felt the shift in the room, the sudden silence that falls when something forbidden yet beautiful begins. Albert's hand found the small of her back, his other clasping hers, firm yet tender. They began to move, perfectly measured, perfectly timed. The waltz carried them in slow circles beneath the chandelier's golden light. Constance's gown brushed against his coat, the fabric whispering secrets neither dared speak aloud. "You dance well," she murmured. He smiled faintly. "It was once expected of me." "Listen now." "Now," he said quietly. "It feels like remembering who I was before everything turned to duty." His words reached her like a confession. "Perhaps you could still be that man, if you wished it." He met her gaze, the faintest ache in his eyes. "There are some wishes, Miss Harrowby, that life denies us by design." Their movements slowed, the world shrinking to the rhythm of their breath. For a moment, she forgot the audience, the whispers, the falseness of their engagement. There was only the warmth of his hand, the steadiness of his presence, the dangerous truth that she was beginning to need it. When the music ended, applause rippled politely through the room. Albert released her hand with reluctance that only she noticed. "You have given them what they came for," he said softly. "And you?" she asked. "What did you come for?" His answer was a whisper near her ear. "To remember how it feels to be seen." Before she could reply, a movement near the doorway drew their attention. The steward, Mr. Hargreaves, stood with an anxious expression holding a folded letter. He stepped forward, bowing. "My lord, this arrived just now. Marked urgent." Albert took it, scanning the seal briefly before tucking it into his coat pocket. "Thank you, Hargreaves." Constance noticed the faint tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers pressed against the fabric as though he already knew what the letter contained. "Is something wrong?" she asked softly. "Estate matters," he replied, his tone too calm. Nothing you need concern yourself with. But as the evening drew on, she saw him retreat into silence, his smiles forced, his laughter mechanical. When the guests finally departed and the last carriage rolled away, Albert stood by the window of the now empty drawing-room, staring out into the misty night. Constance approached quietly, the hem of her gown brushing the polished floor. "You should not carry everything alone," she said. He did not turn. "Some burdens are not meant to be shared." "You speak as though isolation were virtue," she said gently. "Perhaps it is," he replied, voice low. "It keeps others safe." "From you?" "From the truth," he said, finally facing her. "A truth that destroys more than it heals." Her breath caught. "And yet you keep it locked inside, like that room you showed me." He stared at her, the words striking deeper than she could have known. "You see too much. I only see what you try to hide." He stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. "And what do you think you see, Miss Harrowby?" "A man who pretends indifference," she whispered, "and fails." The air between them burned with unspoken feeling. Albert's hand lifted halfway, as if to touch her face, then stopped, trembling slightly before he drew it back. "Do not look at me that way," he said softly. "It makes me forget who I am." "And who are you, my lord?" His eyes darkened. "A man bound by ghosts." Constance's voice was no louder than breath. "Then let me remind you you're still alive." He inhaled sharply, as though the words themselves broke something open inside him. But before he could speak, footsteps echoed in the hall. Lady Ashmere appeared in the doorway, her expression severe. "Albert," she said, "a word." The Marquis straightened instantly, every trace of emotion retreating behind discipline. "Of course, mother." As he followed her out, he paused, glancing back at Constance. His look was fleeting yet piercing, an apology, a warning and a promise all at once. When the door closed, Constance remained by the window, her heart beating too fast. She could still feel the heat of his nearness, the tension that had hovered like the pause before a storm. Outside, the night pressed against the glass, the fields stretching endless and cold. In the silence that followed, she realized what frightened her most was not his secrets. It was the growing certainty that her heart already forgave them. The clock struck 9, its chime echoing through the hall. Somewhere beyond the walls, the faint melody of a violin lingered. The musicians packing their instruments, perhaps, or some ghost of music that refused to end. Constance closed her eyes and let the memory of the waltz return. The way his hand had guided hers, the way his breath had caught near her temple. A dance meant for show, yet it had felt like truth. And as she stood there, alone in the quiet manor, she understood that she had become part of something dangerous and inevitable. A story that would demand courage and perhaps heartbreak before it could ever dare to call itself love. The storm arrived at dusk. Wind pressed against the windows of Ashmere Manor like a restless spirit, bending the trees outside until their branches struck the glass. The fire in the library roared, though its warmth barely reached the corners of the vast room. Constance sat at a small escritoire near the hearth, her shawl drawn close around her shoulders, the light of a single lamp falling over the papers spread before her. She had not intended to pry, yet curiosity, once stirred, refused to sleep. The letter Albert had received the night of the gathering still lingered in her mind, as did the silence that followed it. Now, as she copied a household account by lamplight, she noticed something peculiar among the ledgers stacked at her feet. An envelope, older, its wax seal half broken, its corner marked with a faint stain of soot. It was addressed in a hand she knew too well. The name, Albert's brother's, curved across the page with familiar confidence. Constance froze. She had read that hand before, in the letters that had summoned her here. Her heart began to pound, slow and deliberate, as if the world itself had narrowed to the space between her fingers and the paper. She hesitated only a moment before sliding the letter free. The ink was faded, the paper creased from being opened too often. She read the first few lines and stopped breathing. The words were affectionate, written in a tone of intimacy and reflection, but they were dated weeks after the supposed accident, after the day everyone claimed the younger Wyndham had died. Her hand trembled. It made no sense unless someone had forged the letter, or unless the man who wrote to her had not died when the world believed he had. The library door opened without warning. Albert stood in the doorway, his dark coat dusted with rain, his hair slightly disheveled from the storm. The sight of him stole the breath from her chest. He was every inch the Marquis again. Poised, deliberate, the flicker of exhaustion beneath his eyes only making him more human. His gaze fell to the letter in her hand. "What are you reading?" His tone was quiet, but the quiet that comes before thunder. Constance rose instinctively, the letter still trembling between her fingers. "It was among the ledgers," she said. "I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean to what?" He crossed the room in 3 strides, stopping a breath away. "To go through my affairs? To invade what is not yours?" His nearness felt like fire, his anger like the storm outside, wild but controlled, striking at restraint's edge. Constance forced herself to meet his eyes. "I meant only to understand. You have forbidden me truth at every turn. How long do you expect me to live inside lies that were not mine to begin with?" Albert's expression flickered between fury and something more wounded. "You are here as my fiancé for appearance's sake, not as my confessor. There are boundaries. Boundaries built on grief," she said, her voice low but steady. "Grief that no longer looks like mourning, but like fear." He stilled, his jaw tightening. "You speak as though you know my heart." "I know silence when it tries to disguise guilt," she whispered, "and I know what it is to be haunted by a promise that was never fulfilled." For a long moment, only the fire dared to speak, cracking softly between them. The wind howled beyond the glass, like something determined to be heard. Albert's gaze dropped to the letter again. Slowly, he extended his hand. "Give it to me." Constance hesitated, then placed it in his palm. Their fingers brushed, an instant of contact that felt like lightning beneath her skin. He unfolded the paper, reading quickly, his eyes darkening with each line. "This," he said finally, "should not exist. What does it mean?" "That someone kept something from me." The storm crashed against the windows, rattling them in their frames. Constance stepped closer. "Was this truly written by your brother?" "Yes." His voice was rough now, stripped of pretense. "But dated after the day he was said to have died, which means either he lived beyond that night, or someone wished me to believe he did." Constance's breath caught. "And you never received this letter?" "No," he said quietly. "It was intercepted." He sank into the chair nearest the hearth, the letter trembling faintly in his hand. For the first time since she had known him, Albert Wyndham looked uncertain, not as a lord, but as a man. The firelight carved shadows beneath his eyes, softening the angles of his face. Constance approached slowly. "Why would someone keep it from you?" "There were matters between my brother and me that are not for polite company," he said, half to himself. "Debts, promises, betrayals, perhaps. I thought they died with him." She knelt beside the chair, her hand resting lightly on the armrest, her voice almost a whisper. "And yet they return. Perhaps they never truly left." Albert's gaze lifted to her, and for the briefest moment the distance between them vanished. "You should not involve yourself in this," he said, though his tone had softened. "It is not your burden." "Then why does it feel like it?" she asked. He turned away, his throat tight. "Because you have a dangerous talent, Miss Harrowby. You make other people's pain your own." The words struck her harder than any rebuke. "Perhaps I do," she said quietly, "but only because I know what it is to be forgotten." He looked at her then, really looked, and in that gaze she felt something shift, something fragile and unexpected, the kind of understanding that does not come from sympathy, but from shared loneliness. The silence grew dense again, heavy with things unsaid. The firelight shimmered between them, flickering across the paper, still open in his hand. Constance spoke first, her voice trembling slightly. "If the letter was kept from you, someone must have hidden it. Someone in this house." Albert rose, pacing before the hearth. "There are few I trust enough to suspect. Hargreaves has been with this estate since my father's day. My mother, she is capable of many things, but deceit is not among them." "Not deceit," Constance said softly. "Protection." He stopped, his gaze sharp. "From what?" "From the truth," she replied, echoing his own words from nights before. "It seems to be a disease here." His lips parted slightly, but he did not answer. He returned to the desk, his hand brushing against another small stack of letters, these tied with a faded ribbon, half hidden beneath ledgers. He drew them out slowly. There were several, each bearing the same handwriting, each dated differently, and one unmistakably written in a hand that mimicked his own. He stared at it, the blood draining from his face. This cannot be." Constance approached, her eyes wide. "What is it?" He handed her the paper. She read the first line, her heart twisting. It was a draft of a letter written to her name, to Miss Constance Harrowby, from the Marquis himself. Or so it appeared. The words were tender, almost poetic, yet Albert shook his head as if the paper burned. "I never wrote this," he said. "The phrasing, the seal, it's mine, but I never wrote it. Someone imitated my hand." Constance felt her pulse quicken. "Then the man who sent for me was not you." "No," Albert said softly, his voice trembling between rage and disbelief. "It was him. My brother. He must have written as me. He used my name, my seal, my position." The revelation struck like a blow. Constance pressed a hand to her chest, the truth too vast to take in at once. "Then every word I believed, every promise," Albert's eyes met hers, filled with guilt, not his own, "was never meant for you to suffer." She turned away, her vision blurring. "And yet I have suffered it all the same." Albert took a step toward her, then stopped, as if the space between them had turned to glass. "You were deceived, yes, but not by me. And I swear to you, Miss Harrowby, if my brother used you for any purpose, I will uncover it." The words were a vow, fierce and quiet. Constance faced him again, her voice breaking with something rawer than anger. "And what am I to you now? A reminder of his sins, a mistake you must correct?" Albert's jaw tightened, but when he spoke his tone was low, almost pleading. "You are none of those things." "Then what am I?" He hesitated, his eyes dark with conflict. "You are the one thing in this house that feels alive." The confession fell between them like a match in dry tinder. Constance felt the heat rise in her chest, the tremor in her breath. Albert's composure faltered. His hand lifted instinctively, almost reaching for her face before he forced it down again. "This is madness," he said quietly. "You cannot feel," she asked, "or you cannot allow yourself to." He turned away, pacing to the window where rain lashed against the glass. "Both," he whispered. The wind moaned outside, carrying the scent of wet earth and distant thunder. Constance approached him slowly, her voice soft. "Then tell me how to stop caring, my lord, for I seem to have forgotten how." He looked back at her then, every defense stripped away. For one trembling moment, the distance closed. His hand lifted once more, his fingers brushing a stray curl from her temple. The contact was feather-light, almost reverent. "Constance," he murmured, the sound of her name both warning and surrender. She drew in a breath, her eyes glistening. "Say my name like that again, and I will forget that this began as a lie." He closed his eyes briefly, as though in pain, then stepped back, the space between them widening once more. "You should rest. Tomorrow I will speak to my mother. If these letters were hidden deliberately, she will know why." Constance nodded, though her throat ached with words she could not say. "And if she doesn't, then," he said, his voice low and certain, "we will find out together." As he turned to leave, the storm outside broke fully, thunder rolling across the valley. Constance watched him go, his silhouette framed by the flicker of firelight. The moment the door closed, she let the tears come, silent, steady, not for betrayal, but for the ache of what might never be spoken. The letters lay scattered on the desk behind her, their ink shimmering faintly in the lamplight. Lies and truth tangled together, impossible to separate. She reached for the one written in the imitation of his hand, tracing the familiar strokes as if they might still hold meaning. The fire hissed softly, a single spark leaping upward and dying in the air. Outside, the wind carried the echo of thunder, rolling over the hills like a reminder that nothing stays buried forever. Not grief, not guilt, not love. And in that quiet, storm-lit room, Constance Harrowby understood that she was no longer simply a guest in the house of another's secrets. She was part of them now, woven into the very letters that should not exist, bound to the man whose silence spoke louder than any vow. Morning came late to Ashmere Manor. The storm of the previous night had passed, leaving the grounds shrouded in damp mist. The air smelled of rain and earth, and the house itself seemed to exhale, a reluctant peace after long unrest. Constance awoke early, though she had barely slept. Her mind replayed the words Albert had spoken the night before, and the image of the scattered letters haunted her with merciless clarity. She dressed without the help of the maid, choosing a gown of soft grey wool with simple lace at the collar. The colour matched the sky outside, muted but resolute. She pinned her hair with deliberate care, as though control over her appearance might steady her heart. When she stepped into the corridor, the manor was still. Only the faint crackle of embers and the distant murmur of servants disturbed the silence. She descended the grand staircase, her hand brushing the cool banister, and made her way toward the library, intending to check once more the letters Albert had promised to investigate. But the room was empty. The papers had been cleared from the desk. The fire had gone cold. Her stomach tightened. He had acted swiftly. Miss Harrowby. Constance turned to find Mrs. Pritchard standing in the doorway, a tray in her hands. "Forgive me, miss. His lordship asked me to bring your breakfast here, should you wish to remain within." "Thank you," Constance said, forcing a smile. "Is Lord Ashmere in the house?" "Left before dawn, miss," the housekeeper said quietly. "He and Mr. Hargreaves rode toward the old tenant farms. There was talk of damage after the storm." Constance nodded, though disappointment pricked at her chest. "And Lady Ashmere?" "In her rooms," Mrs. Pritchard replied, "but she's asked to see you later this morning." The housekeeper hesitated, her gaze softening. "You've stirred something here, miss. Something that's been buried too long. I don't know if that's good or bad, but I do know it's changing him." Constance's breath caught. "Changing him?" Mrs. Pritchard gave a faint, knowing smile. "There's more warmth in this house since you came, more light, even in winter." She set the tray down and left without another word. Constance sat by the window, sipping tea that had already gone lukewarm. Her reflection in the glass looked distant, almost fragile, and yet something inside her had hardened into resolve. She would not be a bystander in a house of secrets. When the clock struck 11, she made her way upstairs toward the family quarters. The corridor to Lady Ashmere's rooms was lined with portraits, generations of Wyndhams, their eyes following her like silent witnesses. At the far end, she paused before the newest painting, Albert himself, painted some years earlier, his gaze proud yet shadowed, as though the artist had captured a man already half in mourning. The door to Lady Ashmere's sitting room stood open. Inside, the older woman sat by the fire, wrapped in a dark shawl, a small embroidery frame resting untouched on her lap. "Miss Harrowby," she said, her voice crisp but not unkind. "Come in." Constance curtsied lightly. "You wish to speak with me, my lady." Lady Ashmere studied her for a long moment. "You have a curious effect on my son. I cannot decide whether to thank you or fear it." "I seek neither gratitude nor fear," Constance replied softly. "Only truth." Truth," Lady Ashmere murmured, setting aside the embroidery. "Such a dangerous pursuit in this house." Constance met her gaze without flinching. "Perhaps it is time danger met honesty." For the first time, something like amusement flickered in the older woman's eyes. "You are braver than most, Miss Harrowby, or perhaps simply too new to know what courage costs." "I am not new to loss," Constance said quietly, "or to deceit." The words hung in the air, sharp as the scent of rain. Lady Ashmere's composure faltered slightly. "Albert has told you, then, about the letters?" "He has told me part of it," Constance replied. "Enough to know someone in this house hid what should never have been hidden." Lady Ashmere rose from her chair with the grace of someone long accustomed to command. She crossed to the mantel, her fingers tracing the edge of a porcelain clock. "There are truths a mother does not speak, not to protect herself, but to protect her son. My younger boy was reckless, charming, and cruel in ways that made people forgive him. Albert inherited duty. His brother inherited ease. Both were cursed by what they loved." Constance's voice trembled. "And what was that?" "Power," Lady Ashmere said. "And you, I think, were meant to be one of its tools." Constance felt the blood drain from her face. "You mean he sought me out deliberately?" Lady Ashmere's eyes met hers. "He used my elder son's name to write to you. I discovered it only after the tragedy. By then it was too late. The letters were locked away, the truth buried with him." "And you said nothing? What good would it have done?" Lady Ashmere asked softly. "Albert blamed himself already. He thought his brother died because of him. I let him believe it was clean, final." Constance stood very still. "You let him live with guilt to protect him from grief. Is there a difference?" the older woman asked bitterly. Before Constance could answer, footsteps echoed in the corridor. Albert appeared at the door, his riding coat damp with rain, his expression unreadable. His gaze moved between them, and tension coiled like a string pulled too tight. "Mother," he said evenly, "I see you've been talking." Lady Ashmere lifted her chin. "It was time." Albert's eyes hardened. "That was not your choice to make." "Nor was deception yours," she replied. Constance stepped forward. "Please, this is not blame. It's understanding." Albert turned to her, the storm of his emotions barely contained. "Understanding is a luxury, Miss Harrowby. What we have here are consequences. Consequences you never deserved," she said quietly. His voice lowered. "You speak as though you know what I deserve." "Perhaps I do," she replied, meeting his gaze. "You deserve peace, but peace will not come from silence." The moment between them burned with restrained emotion. Lady Ashmere, watching them, seemed to fade into the background, a witness to a truth she had long resisted. Albert drew a breath and looked toward the corridor. "There is something you both must see." He led them down the hallway toward the west wing. The corridor was dim, the air cool and heavy, with the scent of old wood and dust. He stopped before a door Constance recognized, the same that had once been locked. The key turned with a slow, deliberate sound. The room beyond was unchanged. Dust-covered furniture, books, the faint ghost of a life abruptly ended. But now, something new lay upon the desk, a small wooden box. Albert opened it carefully. Inside were several letters, yellowed with age, tied with a dark ribbon. He handed one to his mother. "This was among the ledgers. The handwriting is yours." Lady Ashmere paled. Yes, I hid them. After the funeral, I could not bear for you to see." Albert's jaw tightened. "And now?" "Now," she said, her voice trembling, "I see that I was wrong." He looked at Constance, something breaking behind his composed exterior. "Read it." Constance hesitated. "Are you certain?" "Yes," he said softly. "I am done with secrets." She unfolded the letter. The ink was faded, the words written in a desperate hand. It spoke of regret, of a debt unpaid, of a truth meant for Albert that could not be spoken aloud. It ended with a single haunting line: "If you receive this, know that I never meant to die your enemy." Constance read it aloud, her voice barely steady. When she finished, silence filled the room. The fire in the grate flickered weakly, its light trembling over the faces of those who had been bound for too long by ghosts. Albert sank into the chair by the window, his hands clasped loosely before him. "He was alive when I thought him dead. And he wrote to me, and you hid it." Lady Ashmere's voice cracked. "Because you would have gone after him, Albert. You would have destroyed yourself trying to save him." Albert looked at her, the anger fading into something deeper. Resignation. Sorrow. "Then you never understood me at all. I would have forgiven him." Constance moved toward him, her heart aching at the sight. "And now?" she whispered. He lifted his gaze to her, the firelight catching the weary grace in his eyes. "Now I must forgive myself for surviving him." She knelt beside him, her hand resting lightly on his. "You owe forgiveness to no one, my lord. Only understanding, to yourself and to the man you once were." He looked down at their joined hands, his voice a murmur. "You make it sound simple." "It isn't," she said gently, "but neither is love." The last word hung between them, fragile and daring. Albert's hand tightened slightly around hers. His breath trembled as he spoke. "Do not speak to me of love, Constance. I'm a man who has broken too many vows." "Then keep one," she whispered. "Let the next promise be to live." He turned his face toward hers, so close that her breath caught. "You speak as if you have faith in me." "I do," she said, "even when you do not." For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the silence between them more intimate than touch. Lady Ashmere stood by the doorway, watching with tears that she did not bother to hide. At last, Albert rose, still holding Constance's hand. "This room has been a tomb for too long," he said quietly. "It ends tonight." He took one of the letters from the box, fed it to the fire, and watched the flames consume it. One by one, the rest followed, until the past itself seemed to turn to smoke. The air grew warmer, lighter. Constance stood beside him, the flickering glow painting their faces in gold and shadow. He looked at her, his voice soft but certain. "You were right, Miss Harrowby. Some doors must be opened, even when it hurts." She smiled faintly, tears glistening in her eyes. "And now that they are?" Albert's gaze lingered on her face, his expression unreadable but full of emotion. "Now," he said slowly, "we see what remains when the ghosts are gone." The flames crackled softly. Outside, the mist began to lift, revealing a pale blue sky. For the first time, light entered the west wing, spilling across the floorboards in a quiet benediction. Constance turned toward the window, her heart swelling with something she dared not yet name. Beside her, Albert stood in silence, his shoulders no longer bowed beneath the weight of the past. And in that fragile peace, amid the ashes of old letters and the fading scent of smoke, both understood that what bound them now was no longer pretense or duty, but the quiet beginning of something neither had believed possible again. Twilight fell gently over Ashmere, the kind of soft English dusk that seemed to linger between sigh and silence. The last rays of daylight caught on the frost that clung to the hedgerows, turning the grounds into a kingdom of silver. Inside, the manor pulsed with the hush that follows revelation. Since the burning of the letters, the air had changed. Lighter, yes, but uncertain, as though both the house and its inhabitants were learning to breathe again. Constance moved through the hallways with a strange calm, her candle illuminating portraits that no longer looked so forbidding. She had spent most of the day in quiet reflection, helping Mrs. Pritchard restore the west wing now that the doors stood open. The once locked rooms, heavy with dust and memories, had begun to feel less like tombs and more like places that might one day hold life again. But beneath her composure lingered something she dared not name. Every time she crossed paths with Albert, her heart betrayed her, steady one moment, wild the next. He spoke to her more gently now, with gratitude sometimes hidden beneath formality, yet there were moments when his gaze lingered, when silence between them felt too alive to ignore. That evening, after supper, Lady Ashmere retired early. The storm from the previous days had left her tired, her strength waning beneath layers of unspoken emotion. Mrs. Pritchard oversaw the closing of the shutters while the servants extinguished the lamps. Constance, restless, found herself drawn to the conservatory at the back of the house, a place she had discovered only days before, filled with winter roses and the scent of damp earth. The glass panes were misted with condensation. Beyond them, the night was a soft, shifting fog. She set her candle on a marble table and moved among the plants, brushing her fingers across the petals of a white camellia. Its perfection seemed almost cruel in the dim light, too beautiful for such a season. "You favor the flowers that bloom against all reason," came a voice from the shadows. She turned, startled but not frightened. Albert stood at the doorway, his dark coat unbuttoned, his expression unreadable. The flickering candlelight caught in his eyes, turning them to liquid amber. "Perhaps," she said softly, "but I admire their defiance. They bloom even when the cold tells them not to." He stepped inside, his boots making almost no sound on the marble floor. "Defiance can be costly, Miss Harrowby." "So can silence," she replied. Albert stopped beside her, the space between them charged with the kind of quiet that trembles before a confession. "You speak as though silence were a sin." "Sometimes it is," she said, looking up at him, "especially when it hides what could save us." His eyes darkened. "And what is it you think I am hiding now?" Constance's voice softened. "Yourself." He said nothing, but she could feel the battle in him, the tension of a man torn between restraint and the yearning to surrender it. For a moment neither moved. The rain began to fall again, a soft tapping against the glass above them. The sound filled the space like music, and she felt her pulse keep time with it. Albert broke the silence first. "I've spent years mastering control," he said. "Every thought, every gesture calculated. It is how I survive, how I protect what remains. And yet," she whispered, "control is only another kind of prison." His jaw tightened. "Without it, I would be chaos." "Perhaps," she said, stepping closer, "but chaos is honest. It feels, it remembers, it's alive." He looked at her then, really looked, and the mask slipped. The firelight from the distant hall reflected in his eyes, and in that fragile illumination she saw something she had not before, the depth of longing he carried heavy and unspoken. "You should not tempt me with such words," he said, his voice low. "They make promises the world will not allow me to keep." Constance's heart pounded. "Then make them anyway." Albert exhaled sharply, turning from her as though the nearness itself were too much. He placed one hand on the cold glass, the other pressed to the back of his neck. "You have no idea what you ask of me." "Yes, I do," she said. "I ask for truth, not perfection. I ask that you stop running from a heart that still remembers how to feel." He turned back, the struggle plain in every line of his face. "And if feeling destroys what little peace I have left, then it was never peace," she whispered, "only quiet." The words hung in the air, fragile as the raindrops racing down the glass. Albert took a single step forward. "You speak like a poet. I speak like a woman who's been lonely long enough to recognize it in someone else," she said. That undid him more than any confession could have. He closed the distance between them, his breath uneven, his voice breaking on the edge of tenderness. "Constance!" Her name left his lips like a vow. She looked up at him, the world narrowing to the space between them. "Say it again." He did, softer this time, his voice carrying the warmth she had longed for. "Constance." Something inside her gave way. She reached out, not in boldness but in instinct, her fingers grazing the fabric of his sleeve. The touch was feather-light, yet it carried all the words they had not dared to speak. Albert's hand came up to cover hers, his palm warm against her skin. "You should not trust me with this," he said, though he did not let go. "And yet I do," she murmured. The air seemed to thicken around them, charged with the pull of everything forbidden. The rain grew heavier, its rhythm deepening, the candlelight flickering with the wind. Their shadows intertwined on the glass, a fleeting reflection of what neither could yet claim. Albert's thumb brushed lightly across her hand, the gesture tender and devastating. "Do you know what I fear most, Miss Harrowby?" That you will feel too much, she said. He shook his head slowly. That I will not feel enough. Her breath caught. You already do. He laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. You give me too much credit. I give you what you refuse yourself, she said. Forgiveness. His gaze softened, and for a moment he looked almost young again, the years of guilt stripped away. You make it sound so simple. It isn't, she replied, but it begins here. She placed her hand gently over his heart, feeling the steady, reluctant rhythm beneath. His breath hitched, the muscles in his jaw tightening. For a heartbeat, time itself seemed to stop. Albert's voice was a whisper. You cannot stay, and yet you do not want me to go, she said. He closed his eyes briefly, as though her words were both balm and wound. When he opened them again, the storm outside had found its reflection in his gaze. Constance, he said quietly, if I were a better man, I would send you away tonight. But you won't, she said, her tone calm but certain. He looked at her for a long moment before surrendering to truth. No, he murmured, I won't. Their silence after that was not emptiness, but fullness, every unsaid thought suspended like raindrops about to fall. The door creaked behind them, and they both turned. Mrs. Pritchard's voice broke the moment, soft but urgent. My lord, Miss Harrowby, Lady Ashmere requests your presence. She's taken faint upstairs. Albert's expression changed instantly, the Marquis returning with all his composure. Send for Dr. Ellery, he ordered. Tell him to come at once. Yes, my lord. Daish. As the housekeeper hurried off, Constance looked toward the stairwell. I'll come with you. Albert nodded. Of course. They ascended the stairs together, the urgency of the moment pushing aside everything else. In Lady Ashmere's chamber, the candles burned low. The older woman lay against her pillows, pale but conscious. She managed a faint smile when she saw them. My foolish heart, she murmured. It seems even grief tires of itself. Albert knelt beside the bed, taking her hand. You will rest now, he said softly. The physician will be here soon. Her gaze drifted toward Constance. You've brought light into this house, my dear. Don't let it go out. Constance swallowed hard. I won't, my lady. Lady Ashmere's eyes closed again, and her breathing steadied. When the doctor arrived minutes later, he assured them it was exhaustion, nothing more. The tension in the room eased, though the air remained heavy with unspoken fear. Later, when the house had quieted again, Albert walked Constance to her chamber. The hallway flickered with lamplight, casting long shadows along the walls. They stopped at her door, both unwilling to end the night so abruptly. She will recover, Constance said softly. Yes, Albert replied, but I fear she knows more of my heart than I intended. She has known it longer than you have, Constance said, smiling faintly. Albert studied her face in the golden light, his eyes tracing every detail as though memorizing them. I have not thanked you, he said finally. For what? For staying, he said. For standing beside me when every instinct should have told you to run. She met his gaze, her voice trembling. I don't run from truth, my lord, only from lies. Then you are safer here than you know, he murmured. The pause that followed was almost unbearable. Albert reached for her hand, lifted it slowly, and pressed his lips to the back of it. The gesture was chaste, yet it carried a reverence that made her breath falter. Good night, Constance, he said softly. Good night, Albert. He froze at the sound of his name on her lips. It was the first time she had spoken it, and in that single syllable lived everything they had not yet dared to say. When he finally turned and walked away, Constance stood for a long time in the doorway, her hand still tingling where his lips had touched. Outside, the storm had quieted, leaving only the faint dripping of rain from the eaves, a slow, tender rhythm that matched the beating of her heart. And as she blew out the candle beside her bed, she whispered into the dark, "If this is madness, let it come gently." Down the corridor, Albert paused at the window, watching the rain fade into mist. He pressed a hand against the cold glass and closed his eyes. The faint scent of camellias lingered on his sleeve. He knew then that whatever peace he had guarded so fiercely was lost, and for the first time he did not wish to find it again. The morning that followed was clear and brittle, a fragile light spreading over the Cotswolds like a blessing that did not yet know whether it was deserved. Ashmere Manor glowed beneath the frost, its tall windows glinting with pale sunlight. For the first time in weeks, the house was quiet, not from sorrow, but from exhaustion. Lady Ashmere slept under the careful watch of Mrs. Pritchard, her colour slowly returning. The servants spoke softly, as if fearing to disturb the fragile peace that had descended after the long night. Yet beneath that calm, something else pulsed, something warmer, unspoken, trembling at the edges of restraint. Constance walked through the corridors with a shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. The events of the previous night lingered in her chest like music that refused to end. Every step she took seemed to echo with the memory of Albert's voice, the sound of her own name carried in that low, hesitant murmur that had undone her completely. She tried to still her thoughts with reason. She told herself that it was gratitude, that what stirred in her heart was only sympathy for a man burdened too long by pain. But when she reached the grand staircase and saw him waiting below, his posture straight, his eyes lifted toward her, reason fell away like mist before the sun. Albert stood near the hearth, dressed in a dark coat and a cream waistcoat, his cravat tied with uncharacteristic carelessness. The soft winter light caught the fine lines of his face, lending him a weary nobility that made her breath catch. He looked less like the Marquis who ruled this house, and more like a man who had not slept, whose thoughts had kept him company through the night. "Good morning, Miss Harrowby," he said when she reached the last step. "Good morning, my lord," she replied, though the words felt too small for what passed between them. He studied her for a moment. "You rested poorly." "As did you," she said gently. He smiled faintly. "You are observant as ever. I only speak what is obvious." "Then perhaps I should learn to be less so," he said, and for a fleeting instant his voice carried warmth, like sunlight through cold glass. Mrs. Pritchard entered the hall carrying a letter sealed in red wax. "My lord, this arrived from Bath at first light." Albert took it, glancing briefly at the seal. His expression changed, just slightly, but enough for Constance to notice. "Thank you, Mrs. Pritchard." He waited until the housekeeper had gone before he spoke again. "It seems the solicitor has found what remains of my brother's estate. Debts mostly, but also correspondence. Letters to someone who lived near Bristol. A woman." Constance's brow furrowed. "You think she was part of his deception?" "I don't know," he said, his gaze distant. "But I must know. I mean to ride there tomorrow." "You will go alone?" "Yes, it is better that way." Constance hesitated. "And if what you find only brings more pain?" He looked at her then, his eyes heavy with something like resignation. "Then at least it will be honest pain." She stepped closer, her voice soft. "Honesty is rarely kind." "Nor is ignorance," he replied. "I have lived too long with both." A silence followed, deep and uncertain. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his pocket. When he looked back at her, his tone had softened. "I owe you more than an apology for what this house has cost you. You came here as part of a falsehood and have endured truth more cruel than the lie." Constance shook her head. "Do not speak of debt, my lord. You owe me nothing." "That cannot be true," he said quietly. "You have given me back the courage to feel." Her heart quickened. "And what will you do with it now that you have it?" His lips curved faintly. "I haven't decided. Perhaps I'll begin by speaking what should have been said long ago." She held her breath. "Then speak it." He stepped closer, each movement deliberate, as though crossing a distance that had long been sacred. "You have changed this house, Constance. You have changed me. Every silence that once haunted these walls now feels less like punishment and more like waiting. For you." Her throat tightened. "You speak as though I belong here." "Perhaps you do." The words were so soft, she might have imagined them. but the way his gaze lingered made her believe otherwise. Before she could answer, the great clock struck the hour. The spell between them broke, but only outwardly. Inside, something had already shifted beyond undoing. That afternoon, Constance wandered into the gardens. The frost had begun to melt under the weak sun, and the ground gave softly beneath her boots. She walked without purpose, drawn by the quiet beauty of the day. The lake beyond the orchard gleamed like glass, reflecting the pale blue of the sky. She found Albert there, standing near the water's edge, his hands clasped behind his back. The wind lifted strands of his dark hair, and the reflection of the sunlight in his eyes made them seem almost golden. He turned when he heard her footsteps. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said. "You never do," he replied, "though you seem determined to find me wherever I hide." "I could say the same of you," she answered lightly. He smiled, a small, real smile that reached his eyes. "Then we are equally guilty." The silence that followed was not awkward, but full of quiet understanding. She stood beside him, the cold air brushing her cheeks, her breath rising in soft clouds. "Do you remember the first morning you arrived?" he asked. "I do," she said. "You were standing by the door as though you regretted opening it." "I did," he admitted. "And now I cannot imagine what might have become of me had I kept it closed." Her heart faltered at the honesty in his tone. "Perhaps you would have found peace." He looked at her, his expression deepening. "Peace without you would only have been emptiness." The words hung in the air like a confession, too fragile to touch. Constance turned slightly toward him. "My lord." "Albert," he said softly. "When we are alone, call me Albert." She hesitated, then obeyed. "Albert." Her voice trembled on the syllables, and his name seemed to warm the air around them. He stepped closer, his hand brushing against hers. The contact was barely there, but it sent a shiver through her that reached her very soul. He drew a slow breath, his voice low. "If I were a braver man, I would tell you everything I feel, but courage fails me still." "Then let silence say it for you," she whispered. Their eyes met, and in that glance was everything unspoken, the longing, the fear, the fragile hope that dared to live between them. A gust of wind rustled the reeds by the lake. Constance's bonnet ribbon loosened, fluttering free. Albert caught it before it fell, his fingers closing around the silk. For a heartbeat he did not return it. Instead, he traced its edge thoughtfully, as though committing its texture to memory. He looked up at her again. "You make me wish I were not bound by duty or title, that I were only a man, free to follow what his heart desires." "And what does your heart desire?" she asked softly. He smiled, sorrow shadowing the warmth. "You know the answer." "I would rather hear it." His eyes darkened with emotion. "It desires you." The world seemed to hold its breath. Constance felt tears burn behind her eyes, though she did not know whether they came from joy or despair. "And yet you will not take what you desire." "Because I fear what it would make of us both," he said. "You deserve a life unmarked by the ghosts of mine." Her voice trembled. "And if I choose to stay among your ghosts, to make peace with them as you have?" Albert's composure faltered, his control slipping like sand through fingers. "Then you would undo every wall I've ever built." "Then let them fall," she whispered. He exhaled sharply, his gaze fixed on her as though she were both salvation and ruin. "You don't understand, Constance. To love me would mean to bear everything this name carries, the scrutiny, the whispers, the expectation. I cannot ask that of you." "You haven't asked," she said gently. "I've already given it." The honesty of her words broke through the last of his restraint. He took her hand, his grip firm but trembling, and for a moment she thought he might kiss her. But instead, he pressed her palm against his chest, where his heartbeat thudded beneath the fine fabric of his coat. "This," he said softly, "is yours already, though I cannot yet say the words aloud." "You don't need to," she replied. "I hear them anyway." He smiled faintly, his forehead lowering to rest against hers for the briefest, most fragile instant. The world outside ceased to exist, the frost, the wind, the distant cry of birds. There was only the quiet rhythm of two hearts learning to beat in unison. When they finally parted, the sun had dipped lower, spilling gold over the lake. Albert released her hand slowly, as though letting go of something sacred. "Tomorrow I ride to Bristol," he said. "I will uncover the truth and return. And I will wait," she said simply. He looked at her for a long time before answering. "That may be the cruelest thing you could promise." "It is the truest," she said. He bowed his head slightly, then turned toward the house. She watched him go, his figure outlined against the dying light, and for a long moment she could not move. The air was cold, but her heart felt fiercely alive. As twilight deepened into night, Constance lingered by the water's edge. The lake mirrored the darkening sky, reflecting both her hope and her fear. She whispered his name once, softly, as though testing the sound of love before daring to speak it aloud. In the manor behind her, the lamps began to glow one by one, their light spilling across the frosted windows. The silence of the estate was no longer heavy. It was expectant, like the pause before dawn, holding within it the promise of everything yet to be revealed. And as the first star appeared over the horizon, Constance Harrowby understood that her heart had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. She had come to Ashmere as a stranger, but now every beat of her pulse belonged to the man whose world she had entered, and whose heart, against all reason, she had begun to heal. The day Albert rode away, the sky remained deceptively gentle, pale, clean, almost innocent. Ashmere Manor looked the same as it always had from the outside. Honeyed stone, proud windows, smoke rising in quiet ribbons from the chimneys. Yet inside, the house held its breath. Constance did not watch him leave from the front steps. She stood at the upper landing, hidden behind the curve of the balustrade, where she could see the carriage yard without being seen. It was not fear that kept her back, but dignity. A woman who had been mistaken for a scandal once already would not become a spectacle twice. Albert was in the yard with Hargreaves and a groom, fastening his gloves with a care that felt like prayer. When he looked up, as if he sensed her presence, Constance drew farther into the shadow. She watched him mount, watched the horse stamp against the frost, watched the way Albert's shoulders stayed unnaturally straight, as if any softness might break him. He rode out without turning back. Constance returned to her room and closed the door with a quiet click that sounded far too final. She pressed her palm to the wood and stood there for a long time, listening to the manor's silence rearrange itself around her. Waiting was not passive. Waiting was a kind of labor, a kind of faith that demanded strength every hour. Downstairs, Lady Ashmere recovered slowly, her physician insisting on rest and broth and warm blankets. Mrs. Pritchard moved like a gentle commander through the household, making decisions before anyone else could panic. Constance offered to sit with Lady Ashmere, to read aloud, to fetch whatever was needed. The older woman accepted help with the calm grace of someone who had always understood that pride was a poor companion in sickness. That afternoon, while Lady Ashmere dozed, Constance sat near the window with embroidery she barely touched. The winter light made ghosts of everything, portraits, corners, even her own hands. Lady Ashmere stirred and opened her eyes. "You are still here," she murmured, as though half surprised the world had not changed while she slept. Constance lowered her work. "I said I would be." A faint, weary smile touched the older woman's mouth. "My son does not understand how rare that is. He is learning," Constance replied softly. Lady Ashmere studied her face for a long moment, then spoke with a quiet bluntness that held no cruelty. "He will come back wounded no matter what he finds." Constance's throat tightened. "And if what he finds destroys what we have begun to build?" Lady Ashmere's gaze drifted to the fire. "Then you will see what he's made of when the truth demands payment." Constance's fingers curled around the embroidery hoop. "I am tired of payment. I want redemption." Lady Ashmere looked at her then, sharper now, more awake. "Do you love him?" The question fell into the room like a dropped jewel, too precious to ignore, too heavy to pretend it had not landed. Constance did not look away. Yes. The older woman's eyes softened. Then prepare yourself. Love in this house does not arrive politely. It arrives like a storm. Constance swallowed hard. Then let it come. Outside, day faded into evening. The manor's lamps were lit, one by one, turning the windows into small squares of warmth in the winter dark. Constance sat in the library after supper, pretending to read, while the same sentence blurred beneath her gaze. She tried to imagine Albert on the road, the wind against his face, the weight of his purpose pressing at his ribs. She tried to imagine him receiving answers without losing himself in them. Near midnight, hooves thundered across the gravel. Constance rose so quickly her chair scraped the floor. Mrs. Pritchard appeared in the doorway, her eyes bright with urgency. "Miss Harrowby—" "I heard," Constance whispered. They moved through the hall together, the house suddenly awake with soft, hurried footsteps. The front door swung open, cold air rushing in like an accusation. Albert stood on the threshold, his coat dusted with road grime, his hair damp with mist. His face was pale, but his eyes burned with a steady, dangerous clarity. For one heartbeat, Constance could not move. Relief and fear tangled in her chest so tightly she could barely breathe. Albert's gaze found hers and held. His voice, when it came, was low and hoarse. "We need to speak." Constance stepped forward. "Now?" "Yes," he said, and there was something in that single word, an edge of finality, the sound of a man who had reached the end of his own endurance. Lady Ashmere appeared at the top of the staircase, wrapped in a shawl, her posture rigid with determination. "Albert!" He bowed his head slightly. "Mother!" Hargreaves hovered behind Albert, uneasy, as if he already feared what would be revealed. Albert turned his gaze to the steward, and the air sharpened. "You will not leave," Albert said to him. "Not until the truth does." Hargreaves swallowed. "My lord, Be silent," Albert replied, not loudly, but with a quiet authority that made the very servants freeze. Constance felt her pulse hammer. "Albert, what happened?" He looked at her as though his eyes held both apology and devotion. "I found her. The woman," Constance whispered. "Near Bristol." Albert nodded. "Her name is Lydia Wren." Lady Ashmere's breath caught, and for a fleeting moment something like recognition flashed across her features. Painful, swift, concealed too late. Albert saw it. His voice turned colder. "You knew that name." Lady Ashmere lifted her chin. "I knew of her." Constance's stomach tightened. Albert's gaze returned to Constance, gentler for a breath, as if he could not bear to let his fury touch her directly. "She was my brother's secret," Albert said. "Not a wife, not a respectable attachment. A woman he promised things to because he enjoyed promises. He enjoyed watching people build their hopes from his words." Constance felt the sting behind her eyes, not from surprise, but from the cruel familiarity of it. "And the letters?" Albert's jaw tightened. He admitted, through her, that he wrote many of them, some under my name, some under his own, only altered so you would never suspect. He used my seal because it opened doors. He used my title because it made lies look like salvation. Constance's hands went cold. "Why me?" Albert's voice hardened. "Because you were convenient, because you were alone enough to believe, because you had just enough education and grace to pass into this house without immediately raising suspicion, but not enough fortune to be protected by power." Constance closed her eyes for a moment, forcing herself not to sway. Albert stepped closer, his voice lowering, changing, softening the way a blade is sheathed. "Constance, listen to me. He did not choose you because you were weak. He chose you because you were strong enough to survive his cruelty." Her eyes opened, bright with tears she refused to let fall. "And yet I did not survive unmarked." "I know," he whispered. "That is why I rode through the night. Because I could not sleep beneath this roof while you carried a wound he gave you." Lady Ashmere's voice cut in, controlled but tremulous. "Albert, you must understand. Your brother's mistakes were endless. If I had opened every door he dirtied, there would have been no house left standing." Albert looked at her, grief and fury colliding behind his composure. "There is a difference between protection and manipulation." Hargreaves shifted, as if trying to retreat into the shadows. Albert's gaze snapped to him. "And you," Albert said quietly, "you were not merely loyal. You were involved." Constance's breath caught. The steward's face went ashen. "My lord," Hargreaves stammered, "I acted for the family." Albert's voice sharpened like frost. "You intercepted letters." Hargreaves shook his head quickly. "I only did what Lady Ashmere instructed. Lady Ashmere's eyes flashed. "Enough!" Albert turned toward his mother, the pain in his expression so raw it nearly stole Constance's breath. "Did you instruct him to hide the letters that came after the accident? The ones that proved my brother lived longer than I believed? The ones that might have spared me years of guilt?" Lady Ashmere's mouth tightened. Her hands trembled slightly on the banister. "Yes." The admission settled over the hall like snow, silent, suffocating. Constance did not move. She watched Albert, waiting to see if the truth would crack him or remake him. Albert's voice was barely a whisper now. "You let me mourn a man I could have forgiven. You let me bury questions I could have answered." Lady Ashmere's eyes glistened. "And you would have ridden after him and died on some road, chasing a brother who did not deserve you. I could not lose both my sons." Albert's throat worked, emotion pressing hard against restraint. "Perhaps you saved my life, but you stole my peace." Lady Ashmere's face softened with heartbreak. Peace was never promised to this family. A silence followed, long, heavy, terrible. Then Constance stepped forward. Her voice was quiet but steady. "My lady, I understand the instinct to protect, but protection built on lies becomes another kind of cruelty." Lady Ashmere looked at her, shame and pride tangled together. "You speak with the authority of someone who has suffered." "Yes," Constance said simply, "and I will not suffer it again." Albert turned to Constance, his eyes searching her face. "There is more." Constance's heart clenched. "Tell me." Albert drew a breath that shook slightly. "My brother did not die when we were told. He survived the accident for days. He was hidden by Lydia and a few men who were paid with coin he did not have. He wrote to me once truly, because he feared I would never know. He regretted what he had done." Constance remembered the line she had read aloud, the one that had sounded like a ghost begging to be understood. Albert continued, voice rough. "Then he died. Not in a duel, not in noble sacrifice. He died in a small room, coughing blood, terrified, asking for forgiveness too late." Constance swallowed hard. "And Lydia told you this?" "Yes," Albert said, "and she gave me this." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small packet wrapped in oilcloth. He held it as though it weighed more than gold. Then he placed it in Constance's hands. She unfolded it slowly. Inside was the photograph, the same face, the same faint, deceiving smile. But the back of it held new writing, ink faded, hurried, almost desperate. "She deserves better than what I made of her." Constance's breath broke. Her fingers trembled so violently she nearly dropped it. Albert's voice softened, devastatingly tender. "He wrote that before he died." Tears slipped down Constance's cheeks then, silent and unstoppable. Not for the brother who had deceived her, but for the girl she had been when she stepped down from that carriage, with hope pressed against her ribs. Albert took a step closer, his hand hovering near her face without touching, as if he feared to claim comfort that might not be his to give. Constance lifted her gaze. "He regretted it." "Yes," Albert whispered, "but regret does not heal what he broke." "No," she said, her voice trembling. "Only choice does." Albert's brows drew together. "What do you mean?" Constance steadied herself, wiping her tears with the back of her glove. "I mean I will not be defined by his cruelty. I will not be the woman who arrived with a photograph and left with shame. I will be the woman who stayed, who faced truth, and who chose her own ending. Albert's eyes glistened. And what ending do you choose? The air seemed to still, as if the manor itself leaned closer to hear. Constance's voice was quiet and absolute. I choose you. Albert's breath caught. The rigid discipline in his posture fractured, not into weakness, but into honesty. He reached for her hand, this time without hesitation, clasping it as if it were the only solid thing in the world. Constance, he murmured, and her name sounded like prayer and surrender all at once. You have no idea what you give me. She stepped closer, until the space between them was only breath. Then take it. Albert's eyes closed for a heartbeat, and when he opened them, the Marquis was gone. There was only Albert Wyndham, a man finally willing to be human. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles, then to her palm. Slow, reverent, controlled only by the respect he refused to abandon. His forehead lowered to rest against her fingers, his voice breaking. I have lived like a man who believed love was a liability, he whispered, because every love I watched in this house turned into grief. Constance's other hand rose, gentle, touching his cheek with a tenderness that felt like home. Love is not the cause of grief, she said. It is what makes grief worth surviving. Albert's breath shuddered. If I ask you to become my wife truly, if I make this real, will you hate me one day for the weight you must carry? Constance looked into his eyes, steady as the winter sky. I will not hate you for what you never asked of me. I will love you for what you finally dared to give. Behind them, Lady Ashmere made a small sound, half sob, half sigh, and turned her face away, as if giving them privacy was the first honest mercy she could offer. Albert's voice grew firmer, as though he were shaping the words into vows. Then hear me, Constance Harrowby. I do not offer you a perfect life. I offer you a real one, with storms and scrutiny and a name that will demand your courage. Constance smiled through tears. Then let it demand it. Albert released her hand only long enough to reach into his pocket. He drew out a simple ring, gold, unadorned, clearly not chosen for spectacle but for sincerity. He held it in his palm, his gaze never leaving hers. I did not purchase this in some glittering shop, he said softly. I had it in my desk for years, meant for a future I thought I would never allow myself. It belonged to my father. He used to say the strongest promises are the plain ones. Constance's breath trembled. Albert! He slid the ring onto her finger, his touch careful, reverent, as if he were afraid the moment would shatter if handled roughly. I will marry you, he said, voice low, certain and entirely undone. Not as a shield, not as a performance, as truth. Constance's lips parted, emotion swelling in her throat. Then let the village whisper, let them stare. They will not be staring at a lie. Albert's hand rose, cupping her cheek. His thumb brushed the edge of her tear, and his gaze softened into something luminous. May I? He whispered, asking permission with a gentleness that made her heart ache. Constance nodded, barely able to speak. Yes. Albert leaned in slowly, as if giving her time to change her mind, as if honoring every fear she had ever carried. His lips met hers in the quiet hall beneath the watching portraits, tender, restrained, and yet filled with every word he had swallowed for years. It was not a kiss of conquest, it was a vow made in breath. When they parted, Constance rested her forehead against his, her hands gripping his coat, as though she could anchor herself to him. Lady Ashmere descended the staircase with slow dignity, stopping beside them. She looked at Constance with eyes wet and honest. You have my blessing, she said, voice trembling. Not because it is convenient, because you are good. Constance swallowed hard. Thank you, my lady. Lady Ashmere's gaze turned to her son. Albert, forgive me. Albert's jaw tightened, emotion warring with memory. Then he breathed out, the sound of a man letting go of something that had poisoned him for too long. I forgive you, he said quietly, but we will not live in shadows any more. Lady Ashmere nodded, tears slipping freely now. "No," she whispered. "No more shadows." Albert turned to Hargreaves, his voice returning to calm authority. "You will leave Ashmere at the end of the week. You will receive a modest pension for your years of service, but you will never again handle my correspondence." Hargreaves bowed stiffly, shame carved into his face. "Yes, my lord." The household seemed to exhale. Later, when the manor finally settled into sleep again, Constance and Albert stood together by the conservatory windows. The rain had stopped. The sky was clear, scattered with stars that looked like tiny, stubborn lights, refusing darkness. Albert took her hand, lifting it to study the ring as though he still could not believe it was real. "When dawn comes," he murmured, "the village will begin its chorus." Constance leaned into him, her cheek against his shoulder. "Let them sing." He kissed her hair, his breath warm against her temple. "You arrived with a photograph of another man." Constance smiled softly, the pain in the memory finally loosening its hold. "And I found the man who was never in the picture, but was always the truth." Albert's arms tightened around her, as if the world might try to steal her away. "Then tomorrow," he whispered, "we begin again, not as a bargain, not as a shield, as us." Constance closed her eyes, listening to his heartbeat, steady and alive beneath her palm. Outside, somewhere far across the frosted fields, a rooster called, too early, impatient for morning. The sound made her laugh softly through tears. Albert's voice was a tender murmur against her hair. "Constance." "Yes?" "I love you," he said, simply, finally, as if the words had been waiting in his mouth for years. Constance lifted her face to his, her eyes bright. "Then we have survived the hardest part." Albert smiled, a real smile, full and unguarded. "What is the hardest part?" "Believing we deserve it," she whispered. He kissed her then, gentle and sure, and in that kiss was dawn before it arrived, light before the sky admitted it, vows before the world could judge them. When morning came, it would find Ashmere changed. The locked rooms were no longer sealed. The letters had burned to ash. The borrowed face in the photograph had lost its power. And in the quiet heart of the Cotswolds, beneath a winter sky turning slowly toward gold, a mail-order bride and an English Marquis finally stepped into a love that belonged to them, without pretense, without shadows, and without fear. 10 years had passed since that first kiss, that quiet promise between Albert and Constance, and the world had changed in ways both small and immense. Ashmere Manor still stood proud in the Cotswolds, though the years had softened its edges. The house was now filled with the sounds of children's laughter, the smell of fresh bread baking, and the crackle of firewood. Sounds of life, a stark contrast to the silence that had once reigned within its walls. Time had not been unkind, but it had left its mark. The old portraits in the hall had aged along with its inhabitants, the once pristine woodwork now polished by years of use. And the grounds were more overgrown with ivy, the gardens wild with roses and jasmine. Albert and Constance stood side by side, watching as their 3 children played by the lake. The eldest, a bright-eyed boy named William, who had Albert's quick wit and Constance's gentle smile. A daughter, Emmeline, with wild curls like her mother and a spark of rebellion in her every glance, and little Joseph, still toddling around with the clumsy determination of a child learning the world. They were the embodiment of the love Albert and Constance had built, wild, tender, and full of life. Albert's hair had greyed at the temples, but the fierce intelligence in his eyes had only deepened over the years. He stood taller now, as if the weight he had carried in his youth had finally been shared and lightened by Constance and their family. He turned to her, his gaze softening as he watched her smile at their children. "You were right," he said quietly, his voice low but full of affection. "The manor was never meant to be empty." Constance smiled, her gaze still on their children. "And it was never meant to be silent." She had grown into a woman who wore her strength like a second skin, a mother, a wife, and a partner who understood not just the triumph of love, but its quiet persistence. The woman who had once been unsure, who had wondered if she belonged, now stood firmly in her place, by his side, in the heart of the family they had created together. "Do you remember," Albert began, his voice wistful, "the first time we met, when you stepped off that carriage, so full of doubt and courage?" "Vividly," Constance replied, her smile tinged with nostalgia. "You looked like a man haunted by ghosts." He chuckled, his hand brushing hers. "I was, in a way, haunted by every wrong I'd ever done, every mistake I'd ever made. But you taught me to be free of them." She turned to face him, her heart full of the years they had spent together, the hard ones, the ones that tested them, but also the joyous, quiet ones where love had grown in the spaces between the words. "You weren't the only one haunted," she said softly. "I had my own ghosts, but you gave me the courage to face them, to live the life I always wanted, the one I never thought I deserved." They stood together hand in hand, watching as their children ran along the shore, the lake shimmering like a mirror under the afternoon sun. For a long moment there was no need for words. The world had slowed around them. The passage of time felt like a quiet river, meandering gently through their lives, leaving only the memories of love, sacrifice, and joy in its wake. As the evening approached, they made their way back to the manor, walking in the comfort of each other's company. The house was warm inside, the hearth crackling as the last remnants of daylight slipped away. Constance watched as Albert sat in his favourite armchair, a smile on his lips as he looked at their children who had now begun to gather by the fire, their laughter filling the room. "Do you think," Albert asked, his voice full of quiet reflection, "that our children will know how hard we fought to be here?" "They will know," Constance said, her voice filled with certainty. "But more importantly, they will know how much we loved to be here, how much we loved each other." Albert smiled, his heart full, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet intensity. "Then I can ask for nothing more." The years had taught them many things, but above all they had taught them that love was not a fleeting spark, not a moment to be grasped and held. It was a flame that needed tending, patience, and understanding. It was a thing forged through trials, a bond made strong by hardship and crowned by joy. As the children gathered near the fire, the room warm with the scent of wood and hearth, Constance and Albert sat together. They no longer needed to speak of the past, for it had been laid to rest with the promises of the future. They had built that future together, stone by stone, word by word, day by day. And in the quiet moments, they knew the truth of their journey together had been more than the destination. It had been the love they had nurtured along the way. Outside, the stars appeared one by one, flickering softly in the dark sky. The manor had been transformed, not just by the passing of time, but by the love that had filled its halls, the laughter that had echoed in its chambers, and the promise of a future that would never be lonely again. But even in the calm of the night, the memory of all that had come before lingered in the corners of their hearts. The pain, the sacrifices, the moments that had almost torn them apart. And in those moments, they had found each other. Their love had survived the storms. And now, 10 years later, it was a love that would last for a lifetime. Every story leaves something behind, a lesson, a heartbeat, a quiet whisper that stays with us long after the final words fade. The tale of Constance and Albert reminds us that love is not born from perfection, but from courage, the courage to face our wounds, to forgive, and to believe in second chances. Ashmere Manor once stood as a symbol of grief and silence, yet through truth and tenderness it became a home filled with laughter and life. And isn't that what love truly does? It rebuilds what was broken. It teaches us that even the most unexpected meeting can change everything. If this story touched your heart, if you felt the ache, the hope and the beauty of Constance's journey, I invite you to leave a comment below and tell us what moment moved you the most. And if you reached this far, write the word Ashmere in the comments, so I'll know you stayed until the very end, walking every step of this emotional road with us. To everyone who enjoys these stories of timeless love and courage, thank you for being part of this growing community. If you wish to help our team continue creating these romantic period tales, you can send us super thanks on YouTube with any amount you choose. Every gesture, no matter how small, helps us bring more love stories to life. And if supporting that way isn't possible right now, your kindness in sharing this story with friends and loved ones means just as much. It helps the channel reach others who, like you, still believe in love that endures. Don't forget to explore the other romances I've left for you in the cards at the end of this video. Each one carries its own world of passion, redemption, and hope. Thank you for watching, for feeling, and for believing that even after heartbreak, love can still bloom again.